General Marcus Taylor's body was tired, but his mind was sharp, buzzing with the details of his return home. He had spent the last 2 years in command of military operations overseas, overseeing missions that tested not just his strategic intellect, but his resilience as a leader. Tonight, though, the weight of the world was momentarily lifted. The familiar sight of home was like a balm to his soul. It was late, the sun having long since dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a deep navy blue. Only the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the small suburban neighborhood where he had lived for years. Marcus loved this town. It wasn't the bustling, chaotic energy of a big city, but rather a quiet, unassuming place that felt like it belonged in a painting. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, and the occasional child's bicycle left on the curb. It was a world apart from the harsh deserts and mountains where he had spent the last few years, navigating war zones and making life and death decisions. His wife, Cynthia, was waiting for him at home. She had sent him a message earlier, reminding him to pick up a few groceries before he arrived. A simple task, one that felt almost surreal after months of military protocols and high-stakes briefings. Marcus was grateful for the mundanity of it. He'd missed the little things, grocery runs, coffee at the kitchen table, and the sound of his children laughing in the backyard. He took a deep breath, savoring the quiet solitude of the night as he drove down Main Street. The town was mostly asleep at this hour, the streets empty except for a few parked cars and the occasional stray cat darting between buildings. His hands gripped the steering wheel lightly as he rolled down the window, letting the cool night air fill the car. The familiar scent of pine trees and damp earth reminded him that, despite everything, some things never changed. The radio played softly in the background, a slow jazz tune that blended perfectly with the peaceful night. Marcus hadn't felt this at ease in a long time. He was no longer General Taylor, the man who commanded thousands of troops and whose decisions could alter the course of lives. He was just Marcus, a husband, a father, a neighbor. As he drove, memories of his return flooded his mind. The sight of his children running toward him at the airport, their small arms wrapping around him as if they were afraid he'd disappear again. Cynthia's tearful smile as she held him close, whispering how proud she was. It was moments like those that made the sacrifice worthwhile. But there was always a part of him that struggled with the transition. Shifting from battlefield to home life wasn't something they trained you for. But tonight, none of those anxieties had surfaced. Marcus felt grounded, ready to ease back into the rhythms of everyday life. He took the next left turn, heading toward the local grocery store on the edge of town. The parking lot was almost empty, save for a few scattered cars. The store itself was still open, its neon sign buzzing quietly against the darkness. He pulled into a spot near the entrance and turned off the engine, taking a moment to enjoy the silence before stepping out of the car. As he walked toward the entrance, the automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and the familiar sterile brightness of the grocery store washed over him. He grabbed a small cart and began making his way through the aisles, his military discipline kicking in even here. Milk, bread, eggs, fresh fruit. He moved efficiently, his mind briefly flashing to how much simpler this was compared to coordinating a supply chain for an entire battalion. As he reached the checkout counter, the cashier, a young man who couldn't have been older than 19, greeted him with a tired but polite smile. Marcus nodded in return, offering a quiet thank you as he swiped his card and gathered his bags. It was a small, ordinary moment, but it felt grounding, a reminder that he was home. Marcus loaded the bags into the back seat and slid into the driver's seat once more, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of the steering wheel. He had just a few more minutes before he'd be home, before he'd see Cynthia waiting for him with that smile that always made him feel like no matter what was going on in the world, everything would be okay. He pulled back onto the main road, heading toward his neighborhood. The town was still quiet, save for the distant hum of the occasional car or the rustling of leaves in the trees. The calmness of it all began to lull Marcus into a relaxed state. His mind wandered back to the plans he and Cynthia had made for the weekend. Family time, barbecues, maybe a trip to the lake. He smiled to himself, thinking of how good it would feel to spend a few days without any looming responsibilities. That's when he noticed it, the faint glow of headlights in his rearview mirror. At first, he paid no mind to it. After all, it wasn't unusual to see the occasional car passing through the area. But the lights didn't pass him. They remained fixed behind him, close enough that Marcus could tell it was a police car, its shape unmistakable, even in the dim light. He raised an eyebrow, but kept driving, making sure he wasn't speeding or doing anything that would warrant attention. The patrol car stayed close, too close. A flicker of discomfort tugged at Marcus's gut, but he pushed it aside. He was a law-abiding citizen, a man of respect, and there was no reason for him to be concerned. But as the patrol car's lights suddenly flashed red and blue, illuminating the entire street behind him, Marcus's heart sank. He pulled over, his military training reminding him to stay calm and composed. His hands moved automatically, placing the car in park and reaching for his ID and registration. He could already feel the tension rising, but he reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. This was probably just a routine stop, maybe something minor. As he watched the officer approach his window, Marcus's mind ran through the familiar motions: hands on the wheel, no sudden movements, stay calm. But as the officer's silhouette grew closer, something felt off. There was an aggression in the way the officer walked, a kind of determination that didn't match the peaceful quiet of the night. Marcus rolled down the window, offering a polite nod as the officer, Officer Derek Winters, according to the name tag glinting in the streetlight, stared him down. Marcus could already feel the weight of judgment in the man's eyes, though he didn't understand why. "License and registration," Winters barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Marcus handed over his ID and registration, speaking calmly. "Here you go, officer. I'm General Marcus Taylor with the U.S. Army." Winters didn't seem to hear him, or worse, didn't care. His eyes flicked over the documents briefly before his expression darkened. "Step out of the vehicle," Winters ordered, his hand resting dangerously close to his holster. Confusion flashed through Marcus's mind, but he complied, his years of military discipline kicking in. He stepped out slowly, his hands raised slightly to show he was no threat. "What's going on, officer? I've done nothing wrong." But Winters wasn't listening. His grip on Marcus's arm was immediate and forceful, slamming him against the hood of his car. The suddenness of the move took Marcus by surprise, his body tensing as he felt the cold metal beneath him. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears, and a knot of anger and disbelief began to form in his chest. "Stay still. You're under arrest for resisting." Marcus's mind raced. Resisting? He hadn't even had time to resist. The absurdity of the situation began to sink in, but before he could protest, Winters had already twisted his arms behind his back, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists with unnecessary force. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, some with phones out, recording the scene. Marcus caught glimpses of their faces, some horrified, some angry, others merely curious. But no one stepped in, no one said a word. Marcus's chest pressed hard against the cold hood of the car, his muscles rigid as Officer Winters forced his arms behind him. The handcuffs clicked shut, with an all-too-familiar finality, the cold metal biting into his wrists. A wave of disbelief surged through Marcus as the situation unfolded far faster than he could process. Just moments ago, he had been driving peacefully, anticipating the warmth of home. Now, he was being restrained, treated like a criminal, without any real explanation. It wasn't the first time Marcus had faced tense situations. He had endured life-threatening moments in the heat of battle, where split-second decisions determined life or death. But this was different. The danger here wasn't from a known enemy. It was from someone who was supposed to protect the people, someone who had a badge and was sworn to uphold the law. As Marcus's cheek pressed against the hood of his car, the world around him felt surreal, distant, like watching a movie unfold, but being trapped inside it. He tried to calm his racing heart, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate things even further. Training kicked in, reminding him to stay still, stay calm. but beneath his composed exterior, anger simmered. He thought back to his years in the army, all the respect he had earned, all the sacrifices he had made. He had commanded soldiers, stood as a leader on and off the battlefield, and devoted his life to serving his country. But none of that seemed to matter now. To Winters, he wasn't General Marcus Taylor. He wasn't even a man of honor. He was just another black man, suspicious for no reason, guilty until proven innocent. Winters' grip tightened as he shoved Marcus into a standing position, spinning him around roughly. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and in that gaze, Marcus saw nothing but contempt. Winters didn't care about the man in front of him. He cared only about asserting his dominance, using his power to control the situation in the way he saw fit. "Did you not hear me, General?" Winters spat the title like it was a curse, almost mocking. "I told you to step out of the vehicle. You took too long, and that's resisting." Marcus clenched his jaw, the weight of those words settling over him. Resisting? Was this really what it had come to? All he had done was follow instructions, calmly and respectfully. There was no resistance in his actions, no defiance, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered. Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed a few bystanders gathering on the sidewalk. Some stood still, eyes wide with shock, unsure of what to do. Others fumbled with their phones, recording the scene, documenting what was unfolding. Marcus didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more vulnerable. The eyes of strangers were upon him, and the entire event was being immortalized in shaky phone footage. His military training had taught him that everything was about optics. How you presented yourself to the world could make or break a situation. And here he was, humiliated in front of civilians, people who probably had no idea who he was or what he had done for his country. One man in the crowd, a middle-aged guy in a baseball cap, shouted, "Hey man, that's General Marcus Taylor, he's a hero! What the hell are you doing?" Winters ignored the man completely. His focus was singular, a cold determination that made Marcus feel like an object, not a person. Winters pulled Marcus toward the squad car, shoving him harshly against the door before opening it. The officer's breath was harsh, labored, as if he were gearing up for a bigger confrontation. But Marcus offered none. He wasn't resisting because he didn't need to prove anything. The truth would come out eventually. He knew that much. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late. As Winters prepared to push Marcus into the back seat, another police cruiser pulled up, its sirens blaring for a moment before shutting off. The backup officer, a petite woman in her late 30s, stepped out of the car with a quick pace. Officer Jennifer Hayes had been on the force for almost a decade, and in that time, she had learned to trust her gut. As soon as she stepped onto the scene, something didn't feel right. She approached quickly, her eyes scanning the scene. Marcus, in handcuffs, standing near the squad car, and Winters, his posture aggressive, almost itching for a fight. She hadn't been briefed on the situation, only that Winters had called for backup. But now that she was here, the air felt thick with tension. "Officer Winters," she called, her voice professional but with a hint of urgency. "What's going on here?" Winters didn't turn to face her, still focused on Marcus. "Got a situation here. Pulled this guy over, and he didn't cooperate. He's under arrest for resisting." Hayes frowned. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, and something clicked. She knew that face. Her mind raced through the news coverage she had seen, the profiles on military leaders. "General Marcus Taylor?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with recognition. "Is that you?" Marcus turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. "Yes," he said simply, his voice measured and calm despite the circumstances. Winters froze. He had heard the name, but it hadn't registered. Not until now. "General?" He trailed off, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a lead blanket. His grip on Marcus loosened, his hands trembling slightly. His mind raced to catch up with his actions. He had assaulted a general, a decorated U.S. Army general. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. In that moment, his bravado crumbled. He took a step back, as if putting distance between himself and the truth might somehow undo the damage he had just done. The crowd began murmuring louder now, some shouting at Winters, others still recording. Hayes took control of the situation, stepping between Marcus and Winters. "Officer Winters," she said sharply, her voice low but firm. "You need to back off, right now." Winters stood frozen, his face pale, sweat forming on his brow. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. His mind was blank, filled only with the realization that his career, his life, had just taken a nosedive that he wasn't sure he could recover from. Marcus stayed silent, though his anger was boiling just beneath the surface. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could hear their whispers and murmurs, but he refused to let himself be consumed by the rage that threatened to break free. He had faced far greater battles than this. He had survived war zones, lost comrades, and carried the weight of command on his shoulders. This was a different kind of battle, one that he hadn't expected, but one he knew he had to face with dignity. Winters finally stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he tried to regain some semblance of control. I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't know." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and Hayes could already see the storm brewing. People would talk. The video would spread. This would not go unnoticed. She turned to Marcus, offering him a look of sympathy, mixed with professionalism. "General Taylor, I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here. We'll get this sorted out." Marcus nodded slightly, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs, though he remained composed. "It's not the first time I've been treated this way," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, but Hayes heard him, and the weight of those words struck her harder than she'd expected. Without another word, Hayes reached for her radio, calling for the sergeant to report to the scene. She knew this was beyond her now. This was a situation that required immediate attention, and every second that passed only increased the fallout that was sure to follow. The crowd continued to gather, more people stopping to watch, to record. It was a spectacle now, a symbol of the injustice that too many had experienced, a visual reminder of how deep-rooted prejudice and assumptions could tear at the fabric of society. And in the midst of it all, Marcus Taylor stood tall, calm, and unshaken, even as the world around him seemed to spiral into chaos. Officer Winters stood in stunned silence, his body rigid as if rooted to the ground, his mind still struggling to process the enormity of what had just happened. The realization that the man he had aggressively detained was a highly respected U.S. Army general, a decorated black man whose name was known nationwide, hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The crowd that had gathered, a mix of shocked onlookers and those already recording the incident on their phones, was growing larger. The voices of bystanders grew louder, anger simmering beneath the surface of their murmurs. Marcus Taylor, his hands still cuffed behind his back, stood with an air of calm dignity that seemed incongruous with the humiliation he was enduring. He wasn't a man who had just been assaulted by a police officer for no reason other than the color of his skin. He was a leader who had faced adversity far greater than this, and that steely resolve was clear in the way he held himself. But even with his composure, there was no denying the hurt and frustration that simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless men and women who had been through similar experiences, some with far worse outcomes. Officer Hayes quickly stepped forward, her face etched with concern. She had already called for backup, requesting that the police sergeant arrive immediately to assess the situation, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not with how far things had already escalated. She moved toward Marcus, her fingers swiftly and expertly removing the handcuffs from his wrists. "I'm sorry, General Taylor," she said softly, her voice filled with a kind of regret that Winters could never have managed. "This is all just a mistake." The metal cuffs clattered as they were released, and Marcus rubbed his wrists slowly, the cool night air hitting the places where the metal had bitten into his skin. He didn't respond to Officer Hayes right away. Instead, he turned to face the crowd. Their voices had grown louder now, filled with outrage, frustration, and something deeper, a collective pain that came from watching yet another man, Another black man, mistreated by those in power. "Is that really General Marcus Taylor?" A woman in the crowd called out, her voice thick with disbelief. "The man who's been on TV? The one who fought for this country?" "Yeah, that's him," another man answered, holding his phone higher to get a better angle of the scene. "That's the guy, and they put him in handcuffs. Ain't that some shit?" The anger in the crowd was palpable, and Officer Hayes could feel it radiating toward them like heat from a furnace. She glanced back at Winters, who stood frozen in place, his face pale and drawn. He was staring at Marcus, eyes wide, as if the gravity of his actions was finally sinking in. I didn't know." Winters stammered again, his voice shaky. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a shell of the man who had been so sure of his authority just moments before. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus finally turned to face Winters, his expression calm but filled with a quiet intensity that made the younger officer flinch. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the air between them thick with tension. The only sound was the distant murmur of the crowd, punctuated by the occasional shout or flash of a camera. "You didn't care who I was," Marcus said at last, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence the crowd around them. "It wouldn't have mattered if I were a general or not. You saw a black man, and you assumed I was a threat. That's all you needed to justify this." Winters swallowed hard, his face reddening as shame settled over him like a heavy cloak. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say that would make this right, and he knew it. Marcus took a step closer to Winters, his gaze unwavering. "You don't know the first thing about me, but I'll tell you something," he continued, his voice steady. "I've spent my entire life serving this country. I've led soldiers into battle, made decisions that affected lives, and worked to protect the freedoms that people like you enjoy every day. And this is how I'm treated? This is the thanks I get?" The words cut through Winters like a blade. He felt small, insignificant in the face of Marcus's righteous anger. He had spent his entire career believing in the power of his badge, believing that it gave him the authority to control any situation, to make snap judgments without consequence. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he felt that power slipping away. The crowd was growing restless, the anger bubbling over as they witnessed the exchange. Some were shouting now, demanding justice, their voices rising above the murmurs. "This is what we're talking about," someone yelled from the back. "This is why we march. This is why we protest." The tension in the air was palpable, and Officer Hayes knew they were standing on the edge of something volatile. She stepped between Marcus and Winters, her voice firm but calm as she tried to de-escalate the situation. "General Taylor," she began, glancing at Marcus with a pleading look, "I understand you're upset, and rightfully so, but please, let us handle this." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes softening just a fraction. He knew she wasn't the problem here. Her presence had diffused the situation, and she had acted swiftly to correct Winters' mistake, but the damage was done. And it wasn't just about him. It was about every black man, every black woman who had experienced something similar, who had been mistreated, misjudged, or worse. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd before returning to Hayes. "This is about a system that allows this to keep happening. This is about accountability." Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had seen the news, watched the protests unfold across the country. She knew that what had happened here tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that too many were forced to endure. "I understand," she said softly, lowering her gaze for a moment before looking back up. "And I'll make sure this is handled appropriately." Before Marcus could respond, another car pulled up, this time the police sergeant arriving on the scene. Sergeant Daniels was an older man, with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression that spoke to years of experience on the force. He stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately assessing the situation. "Officer Hayes, report," Daniels said, his voice clipped and professional as he approached. Hayes quickly explained what had happened, her tone respectful but urgent. She didn't sugarcoat the situation. Winters had detained General Marcus Taylor without cause, had escalated the situation unnecessarily and had failed to recognize the severity of his actions. Daniel's expression hardened as he listened, his eyes briefly flicking to Winters, who stood off to the side, his posture slumped. The sergeant's jaw clenched, and it was clear he was not pleased with what he was hearing. "General Taylor," Daniel said, turning to Marcus with a respectful nod, "I deeply apologize for what's happened here tonight. This is not how we conduct ourselves in this department, and I assure you there will be an investigation into Officer Winters' conduct." Marcus regarded him for a moment, his face unreadable. "An investigation?" he repeated, the words heavy with skepticism. "How many investigations do people like me have to wait for? How many times have we heard this before?" Daniel's face tightened, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of how to respond. Marcus's words cut to the heart of a much larger issue, one that went beyond a single officer's misconduct. It was about systemic failures, about promises of reform that had yet to be fulfilled. The crowd around them grew louder, their shouts becoming more urgent. The tension was thick, and it was clear that this was no longer just about one incident. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. Every injustice, every protest, every life lost. Daniels turned to the crowd, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice firm. "We're going to handle this. I ask that you remain calm and allow us to do our jobs." But the crowd wasn't interested in promises anymore. They had seen enough, heard enough. Their voices rose in unison, a collective demand for accountability that couldn't be ignored. Marcus, still standing tall in the center of it all, looked out over the faces in the crowd. He saw the anger, the frustration, the pain, and he knew that this moment wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. Turning back to Daniels, Marcus's voice was calm but resolute. "This can't be just another investigation. It has to be more than that. People need to see real change." Daniels nodded slowly, his face grave. "You're right, General, and I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." As the sergeant spoke, Winters remained silent, his face pale and his body trembling. He knew the weight of what was coming, but nothing could prepare him for the public and personal reckoning he was about to face. The crowd was no longer content to stand by, and neither was Marcus. The video of General Marcus Taylor's wrongful detainment and the subsequent confrontation between him and Officer Winters had already begun to spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had gone viral. Clips of the incident circulated across every social media platform, each video igniting debates, outrage, and widespread shock. The hashtags "Your General Taylor," "Justice for Marcus," and "Racist Cop" trended worldwide, sparking an online movement that gathered momentum faster than anyone could have anticipated. News outlets, both local and national, picked up the story almost immediately. Prominent journalists, anchors, and commentators dissected the video in real time, showing frame by frame the aggressive arrest, the disbelief in General Taylor's eyes, and Officer Winters' eventual realization of his catastrophic mistake. This was more than just another instance of police brutality. This was a national hero being mistreated on American soil, a man who had fought for the very freedoms now being denied to him. It wasn't just the news stations or social media commentators who took notice. Activists, public figures, and political leaders chimed in, offering their condemnation of the actions of Officer Winters and calling for immediate action. Civil rights organizations seized on the opportunity to amplify the voices of those fighting against police misconduct, pushing for reform on both a local and national level. The town where the incident had occurred was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters descended on the police station, microphones in hand, trying to get statements from the officers, the department, and anyone connected to the story. But for all the noise, for all the demands for justice, one voice remained curiously absent: Marcus Taylor himself. General Taylor had chosen, for the moment, to remain silent. In the hours that followed his release from custody, he had returned home to his family, surrounded by the comforting arms of his wife and children. Though he was physically free, there was an undeniable weight pressing down on his shoulders, a weight he hadn't felt even in the midst of the most dangerous military operations. Cynthia, his wife, had greeted him at the door that night, her eyes wide with fear and concern. The moment he stepped inside, she pulled him into a tight embrace, as if she were trying to shield him from the world outside. "I saw the video, Marcus," she whispered into his chest, her voice trembling. "I can't believe it. I can't believe they did that to you." Marcus held her close, his hands running soothingly over her back, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to comfort, her or himself. "It's okay, Sin," he murmured, though he knew it wasn't. Not really, but in that moment, he just wanted to be with his family, away from the chaos, away from the noise. Their children, James and Maya, both teenagers, had been glued to their phones, their faces tight with anger and confusion as they watched the viral videos of their father being manhandled by the police. James, the eldest at 16, was especially furious. "Dad, how could they do that to you? You're a freaking general. Don't they know who you are?" Marcus sighed, sinking into the couch as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It doesn't matter who I am, James," he said quietly. "That's the point. I could be anyone. And to people like that officer, I'm guilty just because of how I look." Maya, his 14-year-old daughter, sat beside him, her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "But you didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice small. "Why does this keep happening?" That question had no easy answer, and Marcus knew that. He had fought in wars, negotiated peace, led soldiers through the darkest times. But this fight against injustice at home, felt somehow larger, heavier. It wasn't just about him, and he knew it. This was about every black man and woman who had been treated as less than, every person who had been profiled, harassed, brutalized, or worse. Cynthia sat down beside him, taking his hand. "Marcus, people are going to want to hear from you," she said gently. "The world is watching. They need to hear your voice." He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. But the idea of stepping into the media frenzy felt overwhelming. His entire career had been about serving, about leading through action, not words. But now, his actions had already spoken, unwillingly, unknowingly, and the world was waiting to hear from him. For the next few days, Marcus remained silent, even as the world continued to react. Protests erupted across the country, not just in his hometown, but in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. The footage of his arrest had become the latest rallying cry for those fighting against police brutality and systemic racism, and Marcus Taylor, whether he liked it or not, had become a symbol. In his small town, the protests were intense. The streets outside the police station swelled with people holding signs, demanding justice. "Accountability now," read one sign, while another declared, "No one is above the law." The anger was palpable, the energy crackling in the air like a live wire. The protests remained largely peaceful, with marchers chanting slogans like "Black Lives Matter" and "No justice, no peace," their voices ringing out across the streets. But there was an underlying tension, one that simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. Inside the police station, things were in chaos. Officer Winters had been suspended without pay pending an investigation, and the department was scrambling to control the narrative. The police chief, a middle-aged man named Arthur Collins, was no stranger to controversy, but this was on another level entirely. Collins had been thrust into the spotlight, fielding questions from reporters and community leaders alike, his every word dissected and analyzed. "This department takes these allegations very seriously," Chief Collins had said during a press conference on the second day after the incident. He stood at the podium, his face drawn and weary. "We are conducting a full and thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Winters, and we will hold him accountable if misconduct is found." The words did little to calm the public's anger. Too many people had heard promises of accountability before, only to see nothing change. The community had watched as time and time again, officers were placed on administrative leave, investigations were launched, and yet justice never seemed to be served. In the days that followed, Officer Winters' life began to crumble. The video of him aggressively arresting Marcus Taylor, had become a stain on his reputation that no amount of damage control could clean up. Winters found himself at the center of a media storm, with reporters camped outside his house, his face plastered across every news station and social media feed. At first, Winters had tried to defend his actions, telling friends and colleagues that he hadn't known who Marcus Taylor was, that it had all been a misunderstanding. But as the public outrage grew, even those close to him began to distance themselves. His fellow officers, once quick to defend him, now kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with the man who had wrongfully arrested an American hero. Winters' life had become a living nightmare. Protesters gathered outside his home, holding signs and chanting for justice. His family, too, became the subject of public scrutiny, and the pressure mounted with each passing day. He had gone from being an officer of the law, someone who wielded power with impunity, to being vilified, cast out, and isolated. He spent his days inside, curtains drawn, watching the news coverage of the protests, the calls for reform, and the inevitable condemnation of his actions. Winters knew he was finished. His career in law enforcement was over. But more than that, he was beginning to realize the depth of his mistake, not just professionally, but morally. For the first time, he was forced to confront the racism and bias that had been so deeply ingrained in him, the assumptions he had made without ever questioning them. Winters had never considered himself a racist. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who protected and served his community. But now, as he watched the world's reaction to his actions, he realized that he had been part of the problem all along. His sense of power, his badge, had given him a false sense of authority, a belief that he was always in the right. And that belief had led him to this moment, where his life was unraveling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Marcus Taylor remained silent, watching the events unfold from the quiet of his home. He knew that eventually he would have to speak up, to address what had happened. But he wanted to do it on his terms, not as a reaction to the media frenzy or the protests. He wanted his words to matter, to carry the weight of not just his own experience, but the experiences of every black person who had been mistreated by the system. The world was waiting for Marcus Taylor to speak, and when he did, it would be a moment that no one would forget. Officer Derek Winters sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the flickering glow of the television screen. The news anchor's voice droned on in the background, reporting on the protests, the public outrage, and the ever-growing demands for justice after the viral video of his detainment of General Marcus Taylor. The world had turned upside down in just a few days, and Winters had been at the center of it, his life spiraling out of control. His once orderly world, where he believed in the righteousness of his actions, had been dismantled in the blink of an eye. He had barely left his apartment since the incident. The constant presence of protesters outside his door, the relentless calls from the media, and the judgmental glares from neighbors had made even stepping out to take out the trash feel like a walk through a gauntlet. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from old friends offering vague words of support, others from strangers calling him every name in the book. Each ping felt like a reminder of the ever-growing anger directed at him. The messages weren't just angry rants. Some people had been explicit in their threats, promising violence, telling him to watch his back, or saying he deserved to die for what he did. The fear that had started to creep into his life was becoming suffocating, tightening like a noose around his neck. His badge, once a symbol of authority and power, now felt like a burden too heavy to carry. It had brought him nothing but shame, and he could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. Winters sat on his couch, his hands trembling as he picked up his phone again, scrolling through the endless barrage of news articles and social media posts. Every headline seemed worse than the last. Hero General mistreated in racially charged incident. Racist cop targets black general. And call for officer's resignation grows louder. His name had become synonymous with injustice, and no matter how hard he tried to justify his actions to himself, there was no escaping the truth. His mind flashed back to that night, the moment he had seen Marcus Taylor's car, his immediate decision that something was off, and the way his body had automatically gone into action. He hadn't given Marcus a chance. He hadn't asked any questions, hadn't paused to listen. All he saw was a black man, and in that moment, he had assumed the worst. Even now, he could feel the cold, suffocating grip of his mistake. "I didn't know," Winters muttered to himself, trying to soothe the guilt gnawing at his insides. "I didn't know who he was." But deep down, even Winters knew that was a flimsy excuse. It wasn't about not knowing who Marcus Taylor was. It was about who he thought Marcus was, a threat, an assumption based purely on the color of his skin. Winters had been conditioned by years on the job, by his own biases, by the systemic rot in the very institution he had sworn to uphold. He had been a part of the problem, and now that truth was staring him in the face, unflinching and unavoidable. The thought made him sick to his stomach. He had spent his entire career thinking he was a good cop. He had believed that he was making a difference, that he was protecting the community. But this was something different. This was an ugly reflection of the system he had been upholding, a system that had taught him to view black men like Marcus with suspicion first, humanity second. There was a knock at his door, startling Winters from his thoughts. His pulse quickened. He wasn't expecting anyone, and with the protests outside, he had become paranoid about who might show up. But after a moment, he heard a familiar voice, Sergeant Arthur Daniels. "Winters, it's me. Open up." Winters hesitated for a moment, but eventually rose from the couch and opened the door. Sergeant Daniels stood there, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Winters could tell immediately that this wasn't a social visit. Daniels walked into the apartment, glancing around at the disarray. Piles of newspapers and dishes cluttered the space, and the television droned on in the background, filling the silence. Winters had never been a tidy person, but now his apartment felt like a reflection of the chaos that had overtaken his life. "Jesus, Derek," Daniels muttered as he looked around, "you're falling apart." Winters didn't respond. He simply sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped. Daniels pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, folding his hands in front of him. The air between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words. "You know why I'm here," Daniels said after a long pause. "This can't go on like this." Winters stared at the floor, unable to meet his superior's gaze. He knew what was coming. The investigation into his conduct had already started, and he had no illusions about what the outcome would be. His career was over, but it wasn't just the job he was mourning. It was everything. His sense of identity, his belief in who he was, had crumbled around him. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Winters finally muttered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know it would blow up like this." Daniels let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That's the thing, Derek. It's not just about you. This isn't just about one mistake. This is about a system that's broken, and you just became the face of it." Winters winced at the words, feeling the weight of them settle into his bones. He had tried to tell himself that this was just an isolated incident, that if he could explain himself, people would understand. But Daniels was right. This was so much bigger than one incident, bigger than him. He was part of something far more insidious, and no amount of excuses could change that. "I thought I was doing my job," Winters said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting people." Daniels leaned forward, his expression softening just slightly. "You may have thought that, but you weren't protecting anyone that night. You weren't serving the community. You were making a snap judgment based on bias, and now we're all paying the price for it." Winters felt his throat tighten. He had spent years convincing himself that he was different from the bad cops who made the news for brutalizing people, for abusing their power. But now he was starting to realize that he was more like them than he had ever wanted to admit. Daniels let out a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'm going to be honest with you, Derek. The department's not going to be able to save you from this. The protests, the media, it's too much. The chief is under enormous pressure, and it's not just coming from the public. This thing's gone national. People want heads to roll, and yours is at the top of the list." Winters swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this was coming, but hearing it said aloud made it feel final. "You've been suspended," Daniels continued, his tone regretful but firm. "And once the investigation is over, you're going to be officially terminated. There's no way around it. The department can't afford to keep you on." The words hit Winters like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of him. He had known it was coming, but hearing it made it real. His career, his life's work, was over. Everything he had built, the identity he had crafted around his badge, had crumbled to dust. Daniels stood up, giving Winters a long, hard look. "I know this isn't easy to hear, but it's the truth. And if you want my advice, you need to take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out how the hell you got here. Because this isn't just about one mistake, Derek. This is about everything that led to it." Winters nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. He felt hollow, as if everything he had believed about himself had been stripped away, leaving nothing behind but the cold, hard truth. He had failed. Failed as a cop. Failed as a human being. And now, he had to live with that. Daniels moved toward the door, but before leaving, he paused, turning back to Winters one last time. "Look, I know you've screwed up, but it's not too late to try and make things right. You've got to own this, Derek. The world's watching, and you have a choice. You can either try to do better, or you can let this define you forever." With that, Daniels left, closing the door behind him. Winters sat in the silence of his apartment, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had never felt more lost in his life. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. The memories of that night played in his mind on an endless loop. The moment he had decided to stop Marcus, the way he had escalated the situation without thinking, the disbelief in Marcus's eyes as he had slammed him against the car. For the first time, Winters allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had done. He had been wrong. There was no justification, no excuse. He had been driven by bias, by fear, by the unchecked power that came with his badge. And now, he was paying the price. But it wasn't just him who was paying. Marcus Taylor had been the one wrongfully detained, the one whose dignity had been stripped away in front of the world. Winters couldn't imagine how that felt, to be a man of such high standing. A man who had given everything to his country, only to be treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. The guilt gnawed at him, deep and unrelenting. He had destroyed his own life, yes, but he had also caused harm to Marcus, to his family, to his community. And the worst part was, there was no undoing it. No apology could ever make it right. But Daniel's words echoed in his mind. He had a choice. He could either let this mistake define him, or he could try to make things right, as impossible as that seemed. Winters didn't know how he would begin to atone for what he had done, but he knew he couldn't hide from it anymore. He had spent his entire career believing he was a protector, a man of honor. Now, he had to face the truth. He had failed. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. With a heavy sigh, Winters stood up and walked to the window. The sound of protesters chanting echoed in the distance, their voices calling for justice, for accountability. He listened for a long time, letting their words sink in. This wasn't about him. It was about a broken system, one he had been complicit in. For the first time in his life, Winters truly understood what those voices were fighting for. Officer Winters had dreaded this moment for days, the confrontation that was about to happen. His mind raced with scenarios of how it would unfold, each worse than the last. A part of him wanted to turn back, to avoid facing the man whose life he had derailed. But he knew there was no running from this. Not anymore. The meeting was arranged at the local police station, in a back room away from the noise of reporters and protesters gathered outside. Winters arrived early, his palms sweating and heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed what he was going to say over and over in his mind, but now, sitting in that stark, gray room, everything felt hollow. The rehearsed words faded as the reality of facing General Marcus Taylor loomed closer. Winters had lost sleep over this meeting, his stomach in knots as guilt gnawed at his insides. He had spent his career believing that moments like these were for criminals, for those who had broken the law, not for someone like him. He had worn the badge proudly, believing that it gave him authority and respect. But now, stripped of the illusion that his actions had been righteous, the badge felt like a weight around his neck, pulling him deeper into shame. The door to the room creaked open, and Winter's breath hitched in his throat. General Marcus Taylor stepped into the room with the kind of presence that filled every corner. He didn't need a uniform or medals to command respect. His quiet dignity was enough. His tall frame moved with a grace that contrasted starkly with the tension that gripped the air between them. Winters instinctively rose from his chair, his throat tight, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. General Taylor's expression was unreadable. His eyes calm but piercing, the kind of gaze that could cut through a person's soul. He didn't speak right away, and the silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken truths and heavy with the weight of what had happened. Winters wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence, but no words seemed right. Finally, Marcus motioned toward the chair across from Winters, a simple nod indicating that they should sit. Winters obeyed, feeling like a child who had been called to the principal's office. He fidgeted with his hands, running his fingers over the rough texture of his pants, trying to keep his composure. Marcus remained standing for a moment longer, observing Winters without judgment, but with a quiet intensity. Then, slowly, he sat down, placing his hands on the table between them. His movements were deliberate, calm, but there was no mistaking the underlying storm behind his eyes. Winters could see it, feel it, and it made him feel even smaller than he already did. "I asked to meet you," Marcus began, his voice steady but low, "because there are things that need to be said, and I think you need to hear them." Winters nodded quickly, his mouth dry, unable to find his own voice just yet. He wasn't sure if it was fear or respect, or both, that kept him from speaking, but it was clear that Marcus was the one who should begin. "I've thought a lot about that night," Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on Winters, never wavering, "about how quickly it all escalated, about how you never gave me a chance to explain, to speak. You saw me, and you made a decision before I said a single word." Winters swallowed hard, guilt twisting like a knife in his gut. The rehearsed apologies in his mind felt useless now, drowned out by the gravity of Marcus's words. "You didn't know who I was," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "But that's the point, isn't it? It shouldn't have mattered who I was. General, civilian, father, husband, none of that should have mattered. All you saw was a black man, and in that moment, that was enough for you to decide I was a threat." The truth of it hit Winters harder than he had expected. He had known this deep down, of course. He had played the scene over and over in his mind, dissecting his own actions, trying to understand what had driven him to react the way he had. But hearing Marcus say it out loud made it undeniable. There was no escaping it, no rationalizing it away. I didn't know," Winters stammered, his voice weak and shaky. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I made a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining calm, but his gaze sharp. "A mistake?" he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "A mistake is forgetting your keys or mixing up a date on your calendar. What happened that night was more than a mistake. It was a choice driven by bias, fear, and a lack of accountability." Winters felt the weight of Marcus's words press down on him, suffocating. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant to do what he did, but he knew it would sound hollow. Marcus was right. This wasn't a simple mistake. This was a systemic issue, and he had been a part of it. "You don't know what it's like," Marcus continued, his voice steady but growing more intense. "To live your life knowing that no matter what you accomplish, no matter how hard you work, no matter what title you hold, there will always be people who see you as a threat because of the color of your skin." Winters felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never truly considered what it was like to live with that constant burden, the knowledge that at any moment someone could see you as less than human based on nothing more than a glance. And the worst part was, he had been that person. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Winters. "I've served this country my entire life. I've led soldiers into battle, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and yet, in that moment, none of that mattered to you. You didn't see a man who had given everything to protect his country. You saw a black man, and that was all you needed to justify your actions." The words were a blow to Winters's heart, each one hitting with precision. He had thought he understood the gravity of what he had done, but sitting across from Marcus now, he realized he hadn't fully grasped it. This wasn't just about that one night. This was about an entire lifetime of experiences that Marcus had endured, experiences Winters had been blind to. "I'm sorry," Winters finally whispered, his voice cracking. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Marcus's expression softened just slightly as he regarded Winters. "Sorry is a start," he said quietly, "but it's not enough. It can't be enough. Because this isn't just about you and me, Officer Winters. This is about a system that allows this to keep happening, over and over again. This is about every black man and woman who has been treated like a criminal before they've had the chance to prove otherwise. This is about the people who don't have a title, or a platform, or a voice loud enough to be heard." Winters's head dropped into his hands. His apology had felt sincere, but Marcus was right. It wasn't enough. The problem was bigger than one apology, bigger than one person, and as much as Winters wanted to believe he could make it right, he knew that one act of contrition wouldn't erase the years of injustice that had led them to this point. "I didn't realize," Winters murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't realize how deep this went." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving Winters's face. "That's the problem, isn't it? Too many people don't realize, or they choose not to. They live in their bubbles, comfortable in the belief that the system works for everyone the way it works for them. But that's not the reality. The reality is that people like me have to navigate a world where we're constantly on guard, constantly aware that we might be seen as a threat for simply existing." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on both men. Winters felt a deep shame, not just for what he had done, but for the years he had spent not understanding, not seeing what was right in front of him. "I want to do better," Winters said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how, but I want to do better." Marcus regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "That's a start," he said. "But wanting to do better isn't enough on its own. You have to act, you have to acknowledge the role you've played in this system, and then you have to work to change it. And that's not something that happens overnight. It's a lifetime commitment." Winters nodded, the truth of Marcus's words sinking deep into his bones. This wasn't something he could fix with a single apology, or even with a few acts of contrition. This was a long, hard road, and he would have to walk it every day for the rest of his life. The room fell into silence once more, but this time it wasn't as suffocating as before. There was an understanding between the two men now, a shared acknowledgement of the weight of what had happened. Winters knew that he had a long way to go before he could even begin to make amends, but he also knew that this was the first step. As they sat in that quiet room, Marcus finally rose to his feet, signaling that the conversation was over. Winters stood as well, unsure of what to say, unsure if there was anything left to say. Marcus gave him a nod, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. "Take this moment and learn from it," Marcus said as he headed toward the door. "Don't let it be wasted." Winters watched as Marcus left the room, the door closing softly behind him. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. He had made a mistake, a grievous one, and he would have to live with that for the rest of his life. But now, for the first time, Winters understood what he had to do. The crowd outside the community center had grown larger than anyone anticipated. What had begun as a small gathering of local activists and citizens had swelled into something much bigger, a movement. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds had come together, holding signs that read, "Justice for all, no more silence," and "We stand with General Taylor." The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with a palpable mix of anger, hope, and anticipation. Inside the community center, General Marcus Taylor stood at the window, looking out at the gathering sea of people. The sunlight filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across the polished floor. It was strange, he thought, how quickly his life had changed. Just a few days ago, he had been a private citizen, enjoying the return to civilian life after years of service. Now, he had become the face of a national movement, a symbol of resilience against injustice. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire career serving his country, wearing the uniform with pride, believing in the ideals of justice, fairness, and equality. But despite all of that, despite the accolades and medals, he had still been reduced to a mere stereotype in the eyes of one officer, and by extension, the system that officer represented. Marcus took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to center himself. The speech he was about to give felt monumental, not because of its length or content, but because of what it represented. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the thousands, no, millions, of people who had been through similar experiences, who had been profiled, mistreated, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. "General," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus turned to see Cynthia, his wife, standing in the doorway. She wore a soft, knowing smile, the kind that told him she understood exactly what he was feeling without needing to say a word. She had been his anchor through all of this, the calm in the storm, and as he looked at her now, he felt a surge of gratitude. Without her support, he wasn't sure how he would have managed the past few days. "They're ready for you," she said gently, stepping closer to him. "It's time." Marcus nodded, his face softening as he reached out to take her hand. "Thank you, Sin," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "For everything." She squeezed his hand in return, her eyes shining with pride. "You've got this," she whispered. "You always have." Marcus gave her a small, appreciative smile before letting go of her hand and turning toward the door that led to the stage outside. The sound of the crowd intensified as he stepped closer to the exit, and with each step, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But it wasn't a burden he resented, it was a responsibility he was ready to carry. As he walked through the door and onto the small stage that had been set up at the front of the community center, the crowd erupted into cheers. Marcus paused for a moment, taking in the sight before him. Thousands of faces looked up at him, their expressions filled with a mix of determination and expectation. This wasn't just a crowd, it was a community, united in their desire for change. The cheering subsided as Marcus approached the microphone, the air around him humming with anticipation. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd as he gathered his thoughts. There was no turning back now. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his deep voice carrying easily across the sea of people. "I stand before you today, not as a general, not as a leader, but as a man. A black man who, despite his service to this country, was treated like a criminal for no other reason than the color of his skin." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, the words resonating deeply with many who had experienced or witnessed similar injustices. "But this isn't just about me," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "This is about every person in this country who has been mistreated, disrespected, or dehumanized because of their race. This is about a system that allows that kind of treatment to continue, unchecked and unchallenged for far too long." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in support of his words. Marcus waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "I've spent my life fighting for this country," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I've led soldiers in battle, made decisions that affected lives, and given everything I had to defend the freedoms that we all hold dear. But the incident that took place the other night has shown me that the fight isn't just out there. It's right here, in our own streets, in our own communities." Marcus paused, his eyes locking with those in the front row, his gaze sweeping across the crowd as he spoke the next words with deliberate care. "We are at a crossroads," he said. "This is a moment in time where we can choose to ignore the injustices that are happening around us, or we can choose to stand up and demand better, not just for ourselves, but for future generations, for our children, for our grandchildren." The crowd responded with another wave of applause and cheers, and Marcus felt the energy of their support fueling his own resolve. "I am not here today to tell you that the road ahead will be easy," he continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We are fighting against centuries of systemic racism, against institutions that were designed to keep us divided and oppressed. But if there's one thing I've learned in my years of service, it's that no battle worth fighting is ever easy. And this, my friends, is a battle worth fighting." The crowd roared their approval, the sound reverberating through the air like thunder. Marcus felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest, but he kept his composure, knowing that this moment was bigger than him, bigger than his own personal experience. "I didn't ask to be put in this position," Marcus said, his voice quieting for a moment. "But now that I'm here, I'm going to use my voice, and I encourage each and every one of you to do the same. Because real change doesn't happen because one person speaks out. It happens when we all raise our voices together, when we all demand that the system be held accountable." He paused again, letting his words sink in, watching as the crowd seemed to absorb the gravity of what he was saying. "I want to say something directly to the law enforcement officers who are watching this," Marcus said, his tone shifting to one of firm resolve. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are not asking for you to go easy on us. We are asking for you to treat us as equals, to respect us as human beings, to see us for who we are, not what you assume we are." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, and Marcus knew that these words weren't just for the officers, they were for every black man and woman who had ever felt invisible, misunderstood, or targeted. "This is a moment in history," Marcus said, his voice rising again with passion. "We can choose to look the other way, to stay silent, or we can choose to stand up and demand that this country live up to the ideals it was founded on: equality, justice, freedom, for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause once more, their cheers echoing off the buildings around them. Marcus could feel the power of their collective energy, the sense that something was shifting, that this moment was just the beginning of something much larger. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, allowing the crowd's applause to wash over him, feeling the weight of their support. And as the noise subsided, Marcus leaned forward one last time, his voice filled with both hope and determination. "This fight isn't over," he said, "but we're just getting started, and together we will win." The crowd exploded into cheers once again, and Marcus stepped away from the podium, his heart full as he looked out over the faces of those who had come to stand with him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It belonged to all of them. As Marcus walked back toward the entrance of the community center, Cynthia met him with a beaming smile. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," she whispered in his ear. Marcus smiled, holding her close for a moment. "We've got a long way to go," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I know," Cynthia replied, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "But if anyone can lead us through it, it's you." Marcus looked back out at the crowd, still chanting, still energized, still filled with hope. For the first time since that fateful night, he felt a deep sense of purpose, a sense that his journey was far from over. The battle for justice was just beginning, and he was ready to lead the charge. As he stood there, surrounded by the people who believed in him, Marcus knew one thing for certain: change was coming, and it was coming because they would not stop until justice was won. Months had passed since the fateful night of Marcus Taylor's wrongful arrest. In the time since, the protests had evolved into something far greater than just a local movement. What started in a small town had rippled across the country, galvanizing communities to confront the systemic issues that had long been ignored or brushed aside. The video of Marcus's arrest had become the symbol of a broader fight, A fight not just for justice for one man, but for the dignity and equality of all people who had been marginalized and oppressed by the system. The community center, once a quiet place for local events, had become the heart of the movement. It was here that people gathered weekly to discuss strategies for reform, to share their stories of injustice, and to build coalitions. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a hub of change, where people from all walks of life came together, united in their common goal: justice. Inside the community center, Marcus Taylor sat in a quiet room, reviewing a series of documents spread across the table. He had been working tirelessly, not just as a public figure, but as a leader of an organization that had formed in the wake of the protests, the Coalition for Justice and Accountability. It had started small, just a few volunteers and community leaders, but it had grown exponentially, drawing attention from across the nation. Lawyers, activists, educators, and even some police officers had joined the coalition, all working together to propose meaningful reforms to the criminal justice system. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The weight of the past months was heavy on his shoulders, but it was a burden he bore willingly. Every meeting, every speech, every protest he attended reminded him of the importance of the work they were doing. This wasn't just about fixing one wrong. It was about reshaping a system that had been broken for generations. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for another meeting. Today, they were set to discuss a new initiative aimed at implementing community oversight of the police department, a proposal that had gained significant traction in recent weeks. The idea was to create a civilian-led board with the authority to review cases of police misconduct, ensuring that there was transparency and accountability in the handling of such incidents. Marcus had pushed hard for this initiative. After his own experience, he knew how important it was for the community to have a voice, to be part of the process of holding law enforcement accountable. It wasn't about punishing the police. It was about ensuring that they served the people fairly and justly, without bias or prejudice. As he gathered his papers and stood to leave the room, Cynthia appeared at the door, a soft smile on her face. "You ready?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth. Marcus nodded, returning her smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." Cynthia stepped closer, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done so much already, Marcus. People are listening. Real change is happening because of you." He sighed, his expression softening as he looked at her. "It's happening because of all of us," he said. "This isn't just my fight. It's everyone's." Cynthia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know. But you've inspired people. You've shown them that it's possible to stand up and make a difference." Marcus smiled, grateful for her unwavering support. "I'm just trying to do my part." Together, they walked out of the small room and into the larger hall, where dozens of people had already gathered for the meeting. The room was abuzz with conversation, a mixture of old faces and new ones, community members, activists, and leaders from various organizations. At the front of the room stood a large banner that read, "Justice, Accountability, and Reform. Together, we can build a better future." As Marcus made his way to the front of the room, he was greeted by nods and handshakes, people expressing their gratitude and support. He had become a beloved figure in the movement, not because of his rank or status, but because of his humility and unwavering commitment to the cause. Once everyone had settled, Marcus took his place at the podium. The room quieted as the crowd waited for him to speak, their eyes filled with anticipation and hope. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice calm but strong. "We've come a long way in these past months, but the work is far from over. What we're fighting for isn't just reform, it's transformation. We are demanding a system that works for all of us, not just some of us, and that requires all of us to stay engaged, to stay committed, and to keep pushing forward." The crowd responded with applause, their energy palpable. "We've seen some victories," Marcus continued. "The police department here has agreed to adopt some of the changes we've proposed, including mandatory bias training and the creation of a civilian oversight board. That's a huge step in the right direction." But we can't stop there. He paused for a moment, scanning the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. We have to make sure that these changes aren't just promises. They have to be implemented, and they have to be enforced, and that's going to require all of us to stay vigilant. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Marcus could see the determination in their faces. These were people who had been fighting for justice long before his arrest, and they were ready to keep fighting, no matter how long it took. "But there's more we need to do," Marcus said, his voice rising with urgency. "We need to ensure that these changes aren't just happening here. They need to happen across the country. In every city, in every community, people deserve justice. They deserve accountability, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." A ripple